Hi, folks. I'm Dan Dworkis, and this is the Emergency Mind Podcast, a space where we bring together lessons from the emergency department and beyond about performing at our best when it matters the most and applying knowledge under pressure. So, we have two guests with us today, and I've been really looking forward to this conversation. We have Andrew Rickson and Samuel Wilson. So, Andrew is a leadership coach, a researcher, and director of the Health Leadership Lab at the Department of Business Strategy and Innovation with the Griffith Business School. He has global experience in executive education, innovation, and leadership and change, and has a core research focus on health leadership with a specific interest in emergency medicine and narrative approaches to leadership development. Sam is a social psychologist whose research focuses on medical and health systems leadership, public perceptions of leadership for the common good, and public interest technology. He's the founder of the Australian Leadership Index, the co-lead of the Public Interest Technology Research Program of the Social Innovation Research Institute, and the deputy director of the Social Psychology of Innovation Research Group. Gentlemen, that is a mouthful, and I'm so happy to have you all on this. We met initially when I was a guest on the Worker Learner podcast with Griffith University on Australia's Gold Coast. We had a great conversation with that, and I've been so excited to have you all back on here. So thank you both for coming.
Fantastic. Great to be on with you, Dan.
It's a great pleasure. And sorry for that bio. It sounds the most verbose, unreadable bio I've ever shared. Apologies.
It's awesome. We'll dig into all of that. I think, though, we actually need to start with a congratulations to both of you who have just launched your own podcast, separate from the Worker Learner podcast, to the EM Leadership Lab podcast. So congratulations on that.
Thanks so much, Dan. That's really cool. Yeah, it's a bit of fun. Basically, over the years, Sam and I have been publishing a number of research articles about our journey through leadership and emergency medicine. And the EM Leadership Lab podcast actually supports the EM Leadership Lab program that we've got. So yeah, it's a really fun place for us to share those thoughts and interviews with significant people like yourself, even as we're going through. Yeah, really great. Thank you.
Just awesome. For folks that haven't come across your work yet, can you all give us a brief introduction of what you do? I know we're talking in general terms about leadership and emergency medicine, but how are you thinking about this and what are you up to these days?
Yeah, okay, great. Maybe I can kick off, Sam, and then you can jump in too. But look, it's probably good that we start with a little bit of a story. You mentioned about narrative approaches to leadership development. So using stories is actually something I'm really passionate about. Sam always is like, oh, here we go. But basically in 2018, actually, we were very lucky. We ended up working with the CEO of the Australasian College of Emergency Medicine and the president, Simon Judkins. And they had a really great vision about giving precedence to leadership in emergency medicine. And that was something we really, like at the time, we didn't quite know what was going on in leadership and emergency medicine. So Sam and I, we ended up doing a systematic lit review and started looking. We found actually there was very little published in this space around leadership and emergency medicine. So wow, that's exciting. Greenfield. And then we ended up doing a Delphi study of directors of emergency departments across Australia and New Zealand. And that Delphi study was centered around what are the leadership challenges that you face in your role. And it was very foundational, actually, to helping us understand some key areas of leadership challenges that then Sam and I created an action research program around to then go for a deep dive into that. And we ended up creating 5 different modules that we used action research to do really a deep dive. And in some ways, ethnographers, because both Sam and I are in the business school. We aren't doctors. It's so funny. I remember the first project I did in an emergency department, people were saying, are you a doctor? I said, yeah, I'm a doctor, but not that kind of doctor. And they say, are you a consultant? Yeah, I'm a consultant, but not that kind of consultant. It was funny. So we ended up the 5 different modules. We had leading self, managing challenging colleagues, leading change, leading up, and then there was an action projects. And through that, yeah, we've learned a lot about the challenges, but also how to engage and do leadership development work. Sam, how about for you?
Yeah, look, that's a really great summary, Andrew. I guess what I would add to that is that it's been a great privilege just to be able to follow our nose with this sort of work. So because we have this long-standing relationship, we've been able to just start with the basics. Where we started, there were 4 papers in Australia about leadership in emergency medicine and only 26 in the world. And they're just, as Andrew said, greenfield. And we had the great luxury of being able to ask questions and discover and build things up from the ground up. And rather than having some assumptions about how things work, the tribe, as it were, has told us and opened its sort of heart and soul. And I think for that reason, we've hit upon these ideas of space and identity and leader identity and how you do it and don't do it. So all this has emerged, I would say, rather organically. And is maybe a sort of unique contribution because there are no prior assumptions, and we've hit upon things that we didn't expect.
Thank you guys for that. That sets this up perfectly. And so before we dig into how you're thinking about this and what you're thinking about leadership, I want to take a step back and have a bit of a why are we doing this? If you were to find me many years ago when I was a junior just starting in emergency medicine, and you were to put me in front of this conversation, I would be like, why are we doing this? Why are we having a conversation with folks who aren't part of the emergency medicine world about leadership in this space? And I think I might have very unfortunately tuned out what was going on here. So there's a model that I want to port over from the Mission Critical Team Institute world that's a bit of a triangle model, right? And the model is involving three different sets of people that work together to produce an effect, right? So one is the operators and what you'd call the communitas, right? The communitas are the group of people that live the life and do the work. They're the firefighters, the ER doctors, the special forces operators, the whatever it is. There's a group that's a second group, which is leadership. These are the folks that run the operations in the other sense of the word in a space, right? They keep the systems running, they control the flow of material and people through space and time, and they do the grand strategic planning. And then you have the academics, right? And I don't list them third because they're the least important. They're just the third as I'm saying the sentence. But the academics are folks that want to create a theory and a grounded sense of what's happening within a space. And they're not necessarily members of one of the first two tribes, right? They might not be the communitas and they might not be the leadership who's running the hospital or the system, but they are able to bring in what you'd call far transfer of ideas, right? So what works in other spaces and to map it onto our universe, they're able to approach things with a different set of lenses, and they're able to see things that we can't necessarily see about ourselves when we look at ourselves. So when we're able to get all three of these universes, all three of these tribes operating together, there's this really awesome synergy that happens. Right? You have the academics bringing in theory and studies and trying to figure out what works, leadership guiding large scale changes, and operators and communitas and cadre changing the actual work that's being done. Conversely, when there's, you think about like the old Legend of Zelda, right? Like you get the whole Triforce thing going on in there. Anyway, yeah, you like that, right? When there's disharmony between these and you get friction, then you see a waste of energy, arguments between people that are not necessarily for the good of the whole community, and a lack of progress and leaving potential on the table. So I'm really excited to bring you all in here on purpose, because this is part of this larger set of conversation, which is how do you take an academic view of a space which is sometimes overly proudly not academic, right? And the emergency department. So I'm going to get off my soapbox. That is the backdrop of why we're having some of this conversation. But let's roll it back just a little bit. So you all came to this project and this idea, this space, as somewhat of, like you said, ethnographers or anthropologists almost, but your training is mostly in business and leadership and sort of innovation from that space. So how and why? What got you into leadership, and what brought you to the precipice of walking into our dirty, bloody world and trying to map some of those concepts? Also, please feel free to contradict anything I just said and upgrade my understanding of it.
I love it. Firstly, look, I love how you've set up the triangle. I think that's so very interesting, actually. And Sam and I have got many stories about the possible breaking of linkage across those three different areas, which is really interesting. Look, if I go first, I can probably talk a little bit about. So I did a project in an emergency department in Queensland in 2014, and it was quite a revealing experience for me, because basically we're brought in to do a communication influencing skills program, and the idea was to help clinicians, particularly doctors and nurses. And it was funny, it was also lined up around the hospital accreditation processes that were going on. And I ended up writing a book called Communicating with Respect. And one of the things that came out when we did some of the diagnostic sort of interviews and stories, like collecting stories around, people were saying, hey, it's about respect, man. Like when we have the interactions. And at the time I was like, wow, okay. And I remember my wife was really pregnant and we were thinking about stuff one night we were away, and I thought, hey, we've got to have this respect, something that hinges on respect. And I created a model that was RESPECT, and it was formed the way that happened. But I really got a heartfelt sense for the emergency, like you say, the communitas, about the challenges that these guys really are facing in their day-to-day environments, shift work, rostered, dynamic delegation, teamwork. Like, it's just crazy environment. Like all the work that I've done, like, yeah, I've done leadership development with BP, I've worked with in government spaces, worked with corporates and all that sort of stuff. That's all very nice. But boom, here we have a whole area where people really need some help. And I felt quite attracted to trying to help that communitas. And as I said earlier, I ended up doing opportunity to do some rural regional leadership programs with ASIM. And yeah, and I also met Sam. Actually, it was funny. This is really going right back. So I met Sam at Swinburne Uni, and Sam and I really got on. Really, we ended up doing a leadership program for the uni, actually, and that was actually how we got together and started to think more about action learning sets and different things like that. And Sam will tell you more of his story. But for me, yeah, the why is actually helping the community, helping the clinicians, the people on the ground, trying to help those guys in many different facets of what leadership means. And it's not just about authority.
Yeah, what I probably add to that is, in terms of the why, one thing that I guess surprised me to some degree was that you have all these super smart clinicians coming out. They're masters of their domain. They know all about medicine and so forth. And then they find themselves in these complex adaptive systems, these hospitals where clinical analysis is important, but I'm tempted to say sometimes that's the least of it. It's a bit of a
totally
jungle. It's very tribal, full of politics, and to help them fulfill their why, to actually help people, that means they have to not only know their medicine, they have to actually know how to navigate these complex systems. And one thing we've discovered is that beneath that medical expertise, sometimes there's a great sort of inability to understand the state they're in and how to navigate this complex system. And so for us, I guess we've had an opportunity, I would say, to hold up a mirror to some of these folks who are so busy always. There's very little space for reflection. And so part of our role, and maybe the privilege of the role, is to provide that reflective space where people can think about these things and turn their mind to things they wouldn't normally talk to. And I think it's true, Andrew, that for some, it can be quite unsettling to stop and pause and think, because some folks realize they're not actually going in the direction that they thought they were going or they want to go. So you have all these tensions and discrepancies, even at the intrapsychic level. Who am I? Where do I want to go? How do I realize my desired future self? All these things suddenly become the issues.
And that's so well put. I think you're absolutely right in there that sometimes the medicine is the least of it, right? The understanding of what's happening and which drug to give, which is wildly complicated and we can certainly talk about. But a lot of times what you have is really a systems or a team or a structural issue that either is the reason the patient's in front of you to begin with. Goldfrank is an incredibly famous ER doctor who wrote a phenomenal textbook of toxicology, but is maybe almost better known for his work on the role of the emergency department in caring for the poor and underserved, and is famous for having asked, there's a common medical phrase, where is the lesion in the body that produces this symptom? So he would always ask, where is the lesion in society that resulted in what happened that brought this person here? Right? To think outside of the space of the hospital in front of you. So it's either a complex system issue that brings the person to you, or a complex system issue that either modulates or prevents or hopefully reinforces your ability to take care of that person with your knowledge. I'm struck by this phrase I was reading the other day about the folks that had invented crew resource management in aviation, right? And they were saying we had well-trained pilots and perfectly functional airplanes, and we were still smashing them into the ground. Like, why is that? Right. And to me, that's like such an analogous question for what we do in medicine, which is we have highly skilled doctors, nurses, dietitians, respiratory therapists, and we have really capable medicine, and we are still smashing things into the ground over and over again, as opposed to succeeding at the level that we could succeed at. So I'm right there with you that it's so much more complex than, in large air quotes here, just delivering medical care. There's a lot to think about in there. What, okay, Sam, you look like you got something to add to that. Rock and roll.
What's coming to mind here is that we also don't want to suggest that the folks we work with don't know how to lead. Obviously, they do, and we see, for example, in the context of a dynamic delegation, they know how to play this complex dance between hierarchical, distributed, and shared, and it's orchestrated so beautifully in some context. And it suggests that in some contexts that are really familiar in the realm of the known, you might say, these folk have the wherewithal to discern what's needed and when, and to sequence these things. And I guess maybe one of our aspirations, perhaps, is to think about how we might be at choice and be as sophisticated when we think about the wider complex system beyond the emergency departments, other departments in hospital. But to your point about the larger why, there is obviously an interface between hospitals and broader society. And we see a lot of doctors we work with who have these very strong social justice kind of motivations as well, that is as strong, I would say, as their medical ethos. So there's a real desire to understand why and to be part of the solution, but maybe an inability to know how, given the limitations of their training.
Absolutely. And I guess I want to throw one thing out there just as a guidepost for us for this conversation and for folks listening to it. So let's assume that if you are working in an ER, you're trying really hard. You're probably very skilled, and you're probably doing your best to some degree with the system that you have. And let's also assume that if you're not working in an ER, you're coming in with a motivation to help and to heal as well. Like, you want people to be better. And if we really believe that, if we really all believe we're in this conversation in order to be better, then we can all check: good, he's good, I'm good, she's good, we're all good. Let's drop that. And now let's ask the question of how can we be better about this? Because I think there's a little bit of dancing that happens around the beginning of some of these interactions. And I certainly see it working in an ER and working with other hospitals. There's this, how are you going to, when I'm on the other side of this equation, when I'm coming in to talk to folks about what they could change, well, who are you to tell me that? You're not a cardiologist or whatever.
Correct. Yeah.
It's true, I'm not, right? But let's just put that on the road and drop it for a minute, because I think there's such potential for us to do better in these systems, both in the microcosm of a particular ER and then the macrocosm of, in general, in medicine. How could we be doing better? We are leaving so much on the table here.
I love that. Yeah, actually, it was funny because one of the things that Sam and I spent quite a bit of time thinking about is, how do you get leaders ready? How do you get people ready for leadership development? And also, who are we to be coming in? We're not, as I said, we're not doctors, we're not consultants, we're not in the communities. One of the things I mentioned about was action research. We decided to take a participatory action research approach. We'll come in and we'll work with you for your improvement. And in fact, your insights that you gain will be your insights. We'll be along with you with that. And I suppose the complex adaptive systems framing that Sam has provided, it's very true. It's very, in fact, it lives at the heart in many ways of the work that we do. And particularly my PhD was in complexity science as well. So I couldn't get away from that, permanent head damage. But the thing that's interesting is, we take a strength-based approach. We take an action research approach we work with. And the other thing, Timothy Galway, who you may know about, he wrote the very great book called The Inner Game of Tennis, right? And he's also written a very interesting piece on the inner game of stress, working with doctors. And one of Timothy Galway's guiding theories was what he called the natural learning theory. And that fits so nicely with complex adaptive systems. And that's basically that if you look at kids. No one teaches a kid how to talk. They can do it. No one really, you can help a kid learn how to ride a bike, but there's something that goes in, like you can over-instruct as well, right? You need to create the conditions for natural learning, and people will do it. But then if you look at, Timothy Galway's got a great equation, which is that performance equals potential minus interference. And that interference is the inner game, right? And I love how he talks about, in the tennis court, everyone knows that the real opponent isn't the one on the other side of the net. It's actually the one inside your head. And so there's that self one, which is the critical self. And then there's the self two, which is actually the potential self, the self that can do all this stuff. But it's self one that goes, you really think you could have done that? You could have done that so much better if you had known this. There's all these things that go on. So for Sam and I, there's been some foundational sort of concepts, if you like, that have worked their way along how we engage with it. So I love exactly what you're talking about, Dan. That absolutely fits into how we've worked with this.
Can I ask you guys a favor? Can you give us a definition of complex adaptive systems? Now, I know that's a massively large favor to ask, but we talk about this on the podcast. We talk about complex systems and rapidly adaptive systems and complex rapidly adaptive systems all the time. And it's occurring to me that it's worth putting some stakes in the ground for folks that are jumping into this conversation partway through.
Fantastic. Sam, do you have
that's the advantage of having two podcast guests is one can be like, that's a great question. Why doesn't the other person?
I wonder if we're running out of time.
I think it's this. I think feedback loops are actually really important with complex adaptive systems. So complex adaptive systems, in a way, it's the most abstract way. You talk about agents. So you've got different actors in the system, and then you've got feedback loops with those actors. Right. And it scales all the way up and all the way down. It's probably the simplest sort of way I can think of a complex adaptive system. And that's the funny thing, is that when you think about leadership, and Sam and I were very keen to do this when we were working with people, is we don't see leadership as authority. You're not in a formal role. That's not, okay, that's leadership. And I love your model, by the way, leadership, absolutely. But leadership happens interactionally. It happens as a set of practices. It happens as a set of skills. And so in a complex adaptive system understanding of the world, you can see your leadership happen moment to moment, not dependent on role or authority. And so our work has been based on that to help, and because action research is empowering as well, it's quite empowering to think, hey, there's things I can do. It doesn't matter what position of the hierarchy I'm in, I can play a role in help moving that along.
And maybe something else to add to that too, and here I'm drawing upon the work of people like Adam Kahane and Otto Scharmer, for example. We think about the different types of complexity that occur in these systems too. So we might think about social complexity, which refers to the diversity of beliefs and worldviews and values and so forth that all coexist, that all are required for a system to function. This notion of response diversity, perhaps from resilient science. We also think about the dynamic complexity as well, where just how there are these feedback loops. They don't always, sometimes there are delays in these systems, and it's not always clear how one thing leads to another. And there's those notions of generative complexity as well, where you just don't, the future of the system can't be predicted necessarily from any sort of given present state. And I guess part of this raises for us issues about learning environments. And there's this really nice idea of kind versus wicked learning environments. This guy, Robin Hogarth, proposed this notion.
I was hoping we'd get there. Yeah.
And so from a leadership and social perspective, some environments are kind environments. You can learn the right lessons very quickly. But of course, in these systems where there are all these massive interdependencies, not only within the ED itself, but across departments and so forth, even from hospitals to governments, the funding sources, for example. You have all these sources of complexity, uncertainty, and sometimes we notice that people draw the right lessons about the state they're in and where they're going, and sometimes they draw the wrong lessons from that. And so part of what we try to do, Dan, is to provide a kind of a sort of workspace where people can go into and think about these things and maybe reevaluate some of the connections between one thing and another, and maybe decide, have I drawn the right conclusion from here? But also to think what could be, because to your point earlier about better is the world of ought and shoulds. This is the moral realm almost, rather than the sort of realm of what actually is. So better, we can agree about a particular problem, but we might have a different sense of what better looks like and what we should navigate towards. And that it itself opens up the world of social complexity. So if you want to navigate somewhere and I want to navigate somewhere else, then we've got a social challenge on our hands.
Yeah. Oh, please.
Oh, look, I think that was a really nice connection to identity workspace as well, and how leadership development is really about identity and who we're being, who we're becoming, and how do you set up a space for that, which I think is an interesting sort of difference in some of the work that we've been doing. And certainly the paper we sent you through, that was the connection with identity workspaces and what we're finding with that. Sorry to jump in over you there.
No, there's a couple threads I want to loop back on here, and then we can get to identity spaces of leaders, because I think that's important. So if you're just hitting this types of learning environments, it's particularly important for the folks that are probably listening to this podcast. And we have kind and unkind. And then for some of our folks listening to this, there's probably also a third kind, which would be antagonistic. which is a little bit different on top of that, right? So kind is, generally speaking, and you all jump in and fix this wherever I go awry here, but you have tight coupling between the inputs and outputs of a system, both in time and space. You have repeatability of situations, so you can learn what's happening from it. And you have the ability to see the outcomes about what happens based on your choices. And I'm sure there's more in there that I'm missing. Is that what else is on that?
That's how I would characterize it.
All right. Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Unkind is generally an environment where it's harder to generate expertise from a thing. And that could be because of any of the things are different, right? So either there are longer lags between the inputs and the outputs of a system, you don't get to see the outputs of a system, or you're facing something that's so rare that you don't really have the repetitions on it to try to generate any sort of a pattern matching space from it. And then in our world, we'll also have antagonistic, which is where there's another actor, and that actor might be actively trying to fool you, right? That person is preventing and actively disengaging the coupling between the inputs and the outputs, or they are adding extraneous cognitive load, preventing you from using that energy to actually learn the relationship of it, or they're obscuring things, or in some environments, they're actually, say, shooting at you and making it very challenging for you to stick around and learn what happens, or engaging the amygdala or other parts of your brain that prevent learning from happening as efficiently. So there's a lot of thoughts in there about recognizing where you are on the spectrum, taking advantage of the bubbles of kindness within the unkind or even antagonistic world. We talk about what is leadership. One of those roles, I think, is to create spaces where people are more likely to learn, right? So you can ask that idea of, are we generating the conditions for people to learn and actively addressing the unkind or even antagonistic conditions they might face? I don't know if that plays into where we were going with this for that identity of a leader or not, but it
does. I think it does. So what comes to mind for me is that, and this may take the conversation in a helpful or unhelpful way, so happy to be pulled. Yeah. But the whole thing about this learning environments is that these environments train our intuitions and train our expectations and train our heuristics as well. And so this is relevant for anything, really, of course. We all need good rules of thumb to navigate, particularly in high pressure situations. But you must also think in terms of socially, are you learning the right heuristics about how to deal with your colleagues, for example? So it may well be that you might have a particularly antagonistic environment where you learn that those with authority dominate their peers. So that's the ideal to navigate towards, which may work in the short term, but has a long tail of unhappiness and demoralization and so forth. So you might think about, how do our interactions and the consequences of those interactions, how do they educate our intuitions about how we should be and lead and maybe conduct ourselves among our peers?
Yeah, I think first off, I think long tail of unhappiness is a phenomenal band name. I just think that's just like one of the greatest, like, let's just put a pin in that for maybe later, but so-and-so in the long tail of unhappiness. But in any case, I think we're drifting here into the space of something that I think is a huge important thing for folks in the ER to think through. Is you're looking at the interface really between the work of Kahneman and System 1, System 2 thinking, and Klein and naturalistic decision making. And so you're seeing, where is there one of these two systems of decision making being played out in the other? And that pivotal paper that they wrote, Failure to Disagree Together, I think should largely be required reading for folks when they've achieved a certain level of expertise in emergency medicine. Because to me, you're getting at the real question here: is this a part of the universe where I can be an expert or not? Is the universe wired in such a way within this complex system that I can develop expertise or not? What's interesting to me, Sam, about what you just said is that we're pulling out now some of the other facets of leadership that are really different from, say, technical or skills-based leading. So often when we ask that, can I be an expert here, we're really thinking about, can I be an expert in the medicine? Is this part of... Oh yeah, shoot, take it away.
I love it. You got me going here. I mean, that's it. I'm just wondering, Dan, if you're familiar, I wonder if your audience is familiar with the work of Torbett. Bill Torbett has written about action logics. He's written a very well-known paper, and it's Harvard Business Review. It's called The 7 Transformations of a Leader, or 7 Transformations of Leadership, actually. And Sam and I have been looking into this, actually, and that the beauty of action logics actually is that it's about sense making. In fact, you can see leadership actually is about sense making and sense giving, right? Now, there's a layer that, how do we make sense of things? right? Now, Talbot's action logics is actually exactly that. It's saying, how do we make sense of things? And then what do we do about it? How do we then create an action, if you like, that is informed by our action logic? Now, the interesting thing is the paper specs out, I think, 7 different kind of archetypes, right, of the action logics. And so he talks through, when you're a kid, you're learning about cause and effect. So you learn about being an opportunist. How can I jump in here and get something done? Da, da, da. But then you start to develop some social nous and you become like a diplomat. So you start to have an orientation to, well, how are people thinking about me? How's this going to be perceived by other people? So it becomes a question about belonging. How do my decisions impact whether they feel like I'm part of the tribe or not part of the tribe, or if they're with me or not, right? That's the diplomat. Then the next layer is actually, how can I develop cause? If I've got cause and effect really right down and I can really get into this, how can I develop some expertise, right? How can I really get on top of that? So become an expert. But then actually what's interesting is you can go beyond, you can keep moving along, right? So you can go, okay, expertise is not enough here, actually. I need to be innovative. I need to come up with some different things. I'm going to be an individualist, right? I'm going to actually go out here on a limb. I'm going to try some different things. I'm going to innovate, be an entrepreneur, if you like. And then the next level is, I think, there's a strategist. So this is actually starting to think about, okay, there's a system going on here. What can I do to work with this system? And then the final level, as they talk about, is the alchemist, right? Making transformation happen, etc. And these levels are really interesting to think about in terms of leadership development, and particularly your action logic. So Sam and I, when we talk about narrative leadership development, one of the things we've been doing, you probably well over narrative medicine, right? It's been around for ages and was really about patients. Yeah, it started off getting GPs trying to have more empathy with patients and reflecting on that. But we invite clinicians to craft stories about interprofessional limits of influence, times when they've hit a wall. So slowing down, I love the fast and frugal, the heuristics. So there's fast ways into leadership development, like the heuristics, adaptive heuristics, but then there's the slow way into leadership development, getting people to slow down, write stories, and then start to go in and think about their action logics. Because what's interesting is when you craft a narrative about a limits of influence story, you'll start to see, oh, wow, hey, I'm working in a expert action logic, and often people, what we've noticed, what's interesting actually with emergency doctors we find is that they sit on the boundary of the system, of the health system, which is really interesting. It was sort of a joke there in the front door and back door of a hospital. There's connect to the community, connect to other hospitals. So actually being an expert is not enough in terms of an action logic. Actually, they've got really an opportunity to be health system leaders in the way that they interact. And so the funny thing is, Sam and I have overlaid facilitative leadership into the work we've done, which is actually about working with the group, working as more of a facilitator. And this actually, if you think about it, your antagonistic space, there's a lot of challenges with taking these relational approaches in antagonistic learning environments. We wrote a paper and it's talked about in the EM Leadership Lab podcast, the power and politics of leading change in emergency departments. So it is tricky. And this is also why, if people are used to antagonistic places of learning, it's like, who do we trust? Who's in this conversation? Do we talk with them? No. So the idea of the identity workspace is absolutely crucial in that sense of how do we create a space, exactly like you said, how do we create a space that's enabling for people to feel like, and it's not just a psychologically safe space, it's a brave space, a space where people can actually start to open up and progress their learning. So you got me going there. And I wound it up. But the action logics, I think is a really interesting way of starting to look at opportunities for leadership development, basically.
So let me make sure I'm, catching this frame the right way. There's a couple thoughts in here. One is the idea that we want to ask, am I learning the best lesson I can here in some sense or another, right? Not just what did I learn, but is this the right lesson to be learning? And underneath that are these thoughts of what is my worldview of how things operate? which is similar to these sort of levels of leadership, right? So there's the worldview where I'm the expert and everything works for me. And then there's the worldview where actually I'm only part of a system. So I need to learn to ride the system. And then eventually this worldview of how do systems change and how can I influence, not by brute force, but by influence the systems changing. Am I on the right track with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say
Sam's
so.
probably got more to share.
That ties in nicely with these ideas of complexity leadership as well, which starts with the assumption that we are embedded in these complex adaptive systems.
Mhm.
One of the things that comes to that work, people like Mary Albean, for example, it basically recognizes that there's not just one style to actually do anything or one approach. You need all these different mutually complementary sort of approaches. And so part of our challenge is getting people to don't throw away your expertise. Obviously, in some
Sure.
respects, that's very important. But I'm tempted, Andrew, to draw upon the Cynefin framework here too. Expertise works well in some contexts where you actually know how one thing leads to another. And a rational response from people who seek your advice is to comply with your advice. So there are different leader-follower relationships in these different types of contexts as well. And I guess part of our work down is to get people to recognize how they may be, if I can put it this way, addicted to expertise in such a way that it colors all of the interactions. So if you behave as an expert with a peer who you don't have authority over, then we're back to that long tail of unhappiness that we touched on earlier. So getting people to be at choice and to be able to have the discernment to recognize what context they're in and what's appropriate. So they may well prefer expertise, but they need to actually have the wherewithal to know when to apply it and when to do something else. And part of our question is, what should that something else be?
It's a really good point. And a good example, a really practical example of this actually is coaching. Now, coaching in healthcare actually is, as I can see it, has hit a zeitgeist. In the last 10 years in medicine and in healthcare generally, people are getting more into coaching, right? Coaching is a way of, and leader as coach is like a really well-known developmental module. Let's help leaders go and learn about coaching. Now, what we've noticed actually is coaching in medicine is somewhat not well understood, and part of it is the action logic, because coaching it's a flattening of the hierarchy. It's a more relational kind of approach, and also it puts aside expertise. Coaching, actually, yes, you can become an expert coach, but actually to have the coaching conversation, you've got to let the other person really into that, right? It's all about opening it up. It's different from mentoring. See, mentoring is well understood because mentoring is about expertise. But coaching, on the other hand, is a very different action logic that sits behind it. A mentor and an expert, very similar. A coach and a strategist, coach and an alchemist, probably very similar action logics, and they're different. So what's curious is that Sam and I, in all the leadership programs that we run, we have coaching as an intimate part of that, and it's peer coaching as well. And we've noticed that the skills of being a coach are not easily obtainable for many doctors because of the expertise they want to. And in fact, the amazing thing, I love emergency physicians, completely get in there, get it done, solution. That's absolutely it. But that's hard as an action logic for being a coach, right? So if you think about developing your people, becoming a leader, how do you build that sort of systems resilience, which is what a leader as coach can do, then this is a real great opportunity that we see for leadership development of clinicians and others in this space.
Yeah, I'm hearing you say some version of you're not always a hammer and not everything is a nail, right?
Yes.
And you need to be a little more sophisticated than that and to think that through. But let's extend that logic a little bit. Okay, I'm listening to this and I'm the captain of a team of paramedics where I'm an ER doctor working in a small shop. And you've just blown my mind that there's all these other ways to think through my job besides expert. What do I do with this? What's my next thought process or my next move? And let's pretend hypothetically that I am a very simple ER doctor without much understanding of this.
The first step is to, excuse me, that was unfortunate timing. The first step is, so you have this possibility, but we're first trying to get people to understand where they actually are, Dan. And so to understand what makes them tick, what are their default routines, what do they default to? Not everyone defaults to expertise. But then, so you have this sort of diagnostic sort of process to understand what is. But at that point, we ask people to invite people to think about what could be. and we don't provide the answer because you have to be a choice in that. And I guess there's another wrinkle in that is what could I be and what should I be and under what circumstances? So things become very complicated very quickly. So there's been a lot of time trying to essentially think about what tool you're working with, but then what tools are available and for what purpose. So we open the process up in a kind of open-ended, lifelong learning type of way in some respects.
Yeah. And I love the focus on better. And you mentioned about better. So one of the things I suppose we try to do with the leadership development is open up that space for how can they become that better version of themselves. And we don't try to input in to say this is how, because if you go back right at the beginning, I talked about Timothy Galway and the natural learning approach, right? If you give and assume that people have got a huge amount of resource, a huge amount of capability and potential, but actually there's a fight inside that's going on, right? Which is the interference. Then our programs and work is actually to help people start to become aware of some different ways of being and becoming. And so being a leader, and this is the funny thing in the paper that we sent you, we are, because emergency medicine is such a fast-paced environment, etc., you don't have a lot of time to think about other ways of being and doing. And so the way that often happens is through role models. And good luck with who you get to see as your role models. So I suppose in many ways what we do is open up a way to help people, and through coaching, right? Like I said, it's setting up, and I love the question, because basically the fundamental of coaching is there's a B. What the B is, let's say better. The B is the place you want to get to, the vision, your future self. Where is that? A place that's better. And then there's the A, where you currently are. How do you build a bridge from A to B? So that's the work that we do. And the tools we bring to that is some of the stuff that we talk more about in the Leadership Lab podcast, and some of the papers we've written. And I guess Sam and I, we've really enjoyed working together, and working, as you said exactly, is how can we translate and map and provide things that might be of use and benefit to the communitas. But I think the other side where we're moving to is the leadership side as well. So currently we're looking at some future research around health leaders and what are the leadership challenges that these guys face. We've certainly mapped the terrain a lot to understand how clinicians at varying levels feel about that. And of course, a number of clinicians end up becoming health leaders in the leadership camp, but it's actually a very interesting sort of tripartite model there that connects around future work and opportunities.
Yeah, I think the difficulty you just highlighted of taking the time and space to think through new mental models of doing your work in a crisis is really important, right? You can't really rewire yourself in the middle of a crisis because you're just operating. So it's a lot of this idea. We talk on the podcast a lot about the prepare, perform, recover, evolve cycle, right? So are you building this thought into evolution, into preparation? Are you asking yourself these questions afterwards? And maybe that's a good ask for you all, right? If I'm an ER doctor and I'm coming off shift, what can I ask myself at the end of it that helps me approach some of these ideas about identity? Is there a little after action tool that I can take advantage of?
This is the benefit. I hope I'm not dodging the question, Dan, but this is the nice thing about these action learning sets where people don't have to necessarily ask themselves questions. So that in a group of others of peers, they have the solidarity. So they have that sense that, oh, I belong. We all of us have had this experience, and there's a great comfort in that. But the people around us, our comrades in adversity, have the questions for us and can allow us to turn the heat up or down as required. So to just help and serve our adaptation. So that could be one way to essentially put yourself in a reflective space without necessarily having the questions. And they could be part of the property of the group who are all in pain. So that could be one way to address that.
The other interesting thing actually is with AI, the ChatGPT, Claude, these tools actually provide some interesting opportunities for debriefing these days. You can actually ask ChatGPT to take a particular role. And I think I love your idea actually is that if people take time, even after the end of a shift, to actually think about better and becoming and their own styles of leadership, that in itself is an amazing slowing down starting to think about possibilities, and then using, and it's going back to, in some ways, you could use your Gen AI for some coaching and reflection work. I think the therapy bit, I think, is so important of your framework, actually, that recover piece, like what we've seen, docs we work with, they're amazing performers, but how's the recovery? And I think that recovery piece is a nice place to work with, because that's the bit where you can either, Sam and I talk about leadership crucibles, places where you feel like, hey, this is in the paper around identity workspaces. Do you perceive the emergency room or department is a place that is a leadership crucible? It's, yeah, I can work with this, or do you go away wounded? And you feel, oh, the politics in this is crap. I've worked with my colleague, I never wanted to see them again. And so you spend the month thinking about that interaction. So yeah, it's very rich stuff.
Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for jumping us into this very deep water and then presumably giving us a bit of a life raft to figure it out with. I'm sure folks listening to this have more questions. Other than the EM Leadership Lab podcast, where could they best find you? Or is that where you want to send them?
Yeah, that's a good place for it. There actually is EM Leadership Lab link, which is a short course that we've got running at Griffith. There's a link there. I can give you that link if you like. Otherwise, yeah, they can find us online.
About being an academic, you're very public, and all of our details are all out there to be found. And we love to chat, and we love to chat again. We love to continue the conversation with you, Dan, and anyone else around the world to just see what we can do with this. It's, as Andrew said, it's a great space.
Oh, just awesome.
I love, Dan, I notice when we're chatting, some of these things, you've got a lot. I love how it's got your thinking going on. And I know there's the show, but also I think outside of the show, it'd be really interesting to chat and unpack more stuff like what's coming through for you, because I love the work you're doing. You're doing leadership development every day, probably, right? Yeah. And the fact that we've caused you to hit pause and to think about some things, I'd love to explore in those spaces for you, what was in that space, because it could be some interesting collaborations for us, actually.
Absolutely. But listen, you guys aren't quite off the hook yet, right? So the thing we do at the end of every episode is give you a chance to issue a challenge to folks who are listening to this, something that you want them to try on their next shift or their next day. We've talked about a bunch of stuff. While you're thinking about what that is for a second, I'm gonna stall for you just briefly, which is to give our formal disclaimer here, which is that our job on the Emergency Mind podcast is to figure out the best of what folks know about performing when it matters the most. It's not to provide medical advice. And neither myself nor anybody else on the podcast is representing anybody that they work for or with. It's all of our own views as we're doing this. And if you want to find out more about us, you can find us at emergencymind.com. All right, disclaimer done. I'm going to turn this over to you all to bring us home with this. What do you want to, what challenge do you want to issue for folks who are hearing this?
Okay, here's my challenge. I'd love listeners to craft a story. So the next time they've had a tough shift or a tough event, I'd like them to use some narrative approach to reflecting. And so what this is really simple. You can choose a genre. So first, choose a genre that you'd like the story to be written in. So is it a fairy tale? In which case, we actually know more about fairy tales than anything else because they were pre-linguistic for us as kids, right? So you know how they begin, once upon a time. You know the type of characters that are in there. The great thing is there's a problem, there's a resolution that happens mostly through magic, which is the beauty of the fairy tale. And then there's a resolution, they lived happily ever after. Or they lived happily never after. That's okay, that's the Grimm's tale side. So that's a fairy tale, but we say choose your genre. It could be sci-fi, it could be Western, whatever it is. Write it up, craft up the story, and then ask yourself, what was that story about? And how does it give me some insight into me as a leader? That's my challenge.
That's awesome. Gentlemen, thank you so much, both for what you're doing, for pushing the field forward, and for coming on the show.
Awesome. Great chatting with you, Dan.